see, mommy's nervous. This is really nerve-wracking. Hello all, I'm Dani, and I'm gonna be your resident zillennial here at I Dream of Pemberley, which at least at the start is going to be a literary review channel for more recent releases, as well as some of our more nostalgic books that we probably have loved throughout life and in childhood. This is like really the realization of a childhood dream. And I called it I Dream of Pemberley because I imagine, like a lot of young women, and I'm sure people just in general, I really loved Austen and the dichotomy between Fitzwilliam Darcy and, more importantly, Elizabeth Bennet, that Austen wrote and read and reread and rewatched multiple versions of Pride and Prejudice throughout my childhood. And so I Dream of Pemberley. As I got older, in like, I would say my teenage years versus like the preteens, just reading like Austen and the Bronte sisters, I moved into a love of fantasy. And so the dreaming, I think, is more of an ode to that aspect of, my literary history and loves. And even down to the logo that I had drawn up, I wanted it to be a little bit fantastical, but also kind of cloaked in the old world vibes of a lot of the novels that I really still enjoy to this day. And a lot of the fantasy I enjoy the most, obviously isn't in our universe, or it could be, but is written in a time unlike our own. So yeah, I have been working on this particular iteration of this dream and like, oh, I am going to call it I Dream of Pemberley, and I'm going to, exist in this book talk, booktube world of things, because these seem to be my people for like, we're going on, I think, 3 years, because life and all the different things that impact whether or not you get things done or how you procrastinate, because it's scary to do things like this. How I was going to start with the first thing I was going to talk about was, and so I decided I'm going to start by introducing you to me. I've told you I'm Dani. My love for classic novels and just literature in general is extensive, and I think all of us, or a lot of us at least, end up naming our fur children, and then I'm sure when human children do abound in life, they're human children after novel characters and just other characters in media that they enjoy. And so I have 4 floofs myself, 3 of which are named after novel characters, and 1 that's named after a character played by an iconic actress in US cinema, and I'm sure you'll meet them all over time. This little fella who is luxuriating in my arms is my Fitzwilliam, and I remember when I first got him, I always knew what his name was going to be. It's like, I'm going to get this kind of dog, just a poodle or a poodle mix, because I wasn't partial. But I was like, it was going to be a boy, and his name is going to be Fitzwilliam, and we all know why that is. And then I also have a Rochester. For our Bronte girlies, we know why. And then my youngest of my 4 dogs is named after Dumbledore and a character called Wulfric Bedwin from the Bedwin saga, Wulfric. And for those that don't know how is he named after Dumbledore and Wulfric Bedwin, well, Dumbledore's name is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. So that's where I got my Wolfadolfa from, because I loved both those characters so much. Obvious reasons to love Dumbledore. If you've never read the Bedwin saga by, I'm going to butcher her name and I do apologize, Mary Baylaw, I really do enjoy it. He basically is a duke which you think Duke, stuck up, and, you know, all the things that come with a lot of our historical literature that's more contemporary in the way that it's written, in the manner in which a Duke lives and whatnot. But in that particular series, he's the oldest brother of many siblings, having lost their parents young, is quite literally the patriarch of the family in a variety of ways, but has true care and concern for his siblings in a way that you don't typically see Dukes portrayed. And don't get me wrong, he has the rough edges, but it's just something about him. Anyway, we'll get into reviewing that series at some point here in the future. After much rumination and going back and forth, I decided today, given the history of how I got to I Dream of Pemberley and the love of literature that I have from childhood, that I was going to make this first video, as imperfect as it may be, more of a nostalgia video where I talk about literary touch points in my life and books that really kind of engrossed me from the beginning. So I definitely didn't start off as a reader. I could have cared less. And when I was in, I want to say the 7th grade, I was like a BC student, because I didn't really care. My mother was like, "Are you planning on getting a scholarship to college?" And I was like, I don't know how that works. What does that have to do with anything? And she's like, "Because, you know, we're not paying for college. You need a scholarship. So, you know, we need to increase these grades because B's and C's aren't going to cut it. We need to be A's primarily and then B's potentially." And so basically, you know, kind of cooling me in and I started school early. So I would have been about 11 at the time because I was 10 in the 9th. No, excuse me, 10 in the 9th grade. See, saying the wrong things, but it happens. I was 10 in the 6th grade and 13 in the 9th grade. So I was probably about 11 at the time. And so I began pursuing things that were more academically inclined, from taking Spanish in the 8th grade to get high school credit to actually paying attention to these things called books that we kind of see and don't necessarily care about outside of, you know, those requisite pizza for reading programs and, you know, the required books you have to get through in school because you have to, you don't have a choice, right? And so when that happened, I distinctly remember a time frame in which it was a weekend that we went to, it would have been Books A Million or Borders. I don't know which, but it was the discount section of those retailers that I would go to frequently at the time, because this would have been 07, 08. And I happened upon 2 novels. One was called The Passport Diaries by, I believe her name is, and I'm gonna let Fitzwilliam go lay down elsewhere so I can pull up these names. I love you, baby. Tamara Gregory was The Passport Diaries. And then the second book I happened upon was The Village Bride of Beverly Hills by, forgive me if I mispronounce this name, Kavita Daswani. And I just distinctly remember them impacting me. One, because they were cultural books. They're not, you know, the typical reads that I would happen upon in my, you know, middle school library. Obviously, they're about grown women. One about marriage directly, and loss, and then coming back to love, post-loss in some ways. And the other about navigating the world, specifically as a professional Black woman of a certain age, and just kind of figuring out where you are in life. And I'm talking about those off of memory because I have not read them in years, but they did impact me to that degree. Still own them to this day, those same books that I probably got for like $1, $2. whatever they cost back then in the bargain section. Wonderful, wonderful books. Interesting cultural touch points in reference to The Village Bride of Beverly Hills, because it, spoke to me about Indian culture, at that age and in time frame where it wasn't anything that I would have considered or ever thought about, how people in different areas live. I am a military kid, so you grow up around a lot of different people, but you don't necessarily think about outside of those that you naturally encounter, especially at that age, how other people live, grow up, what their households look like, how, is it multi-generational, is it not, and all that. And so it was so interesting and eye-opening from that perspective. And I can't remember the quote, of course, because we're talking about it, but it's the one that speaks to, like, you can, live a whole bunch of lives and explore a whole bunch of stories, through the pages of a book, which is true in a lot of regards. And those are the first two, like, big moments for me in my literary history that I remember. And that will always have, like, a really special place in my heart, because they're, like, chapter books. I don't know how many pages, but, not the little picture books that I had been religiously inching at before because I couldn't be bothered. After that, we go to the Pride and Prejudices of the world, probably from something as simple as, them having the little snippets of chapters, like Anchenpoodle for, like, the Grimm's Fairy Tales version of Cinderella that I distinctly remember from 6th grade, which was pre even me liking literature, but being like, oh, that's a very different Cinderella, to happening upon classic literature where we end up on Austen and Bronte, and I start to explore, the world of those books. Not really delving into them as, like, a deep love, but like these are interesting stories. I'll get back to these, I guess, at some point. Because when we're talking about 0708, what are we happening upon next? What a lot of us in this age range will remember to be, our much cherished Twilight phase. And I am a Thanksgiving baby, so November 23rd of 2008, there was this sleeper hit that came out, and it's my birthday time. And one of the things we did back then, I don't know how much kids do it now, is go to the movies. Went to the movies, and what is there but this movie called, Twilight. Ended up being this huge thing that nobody thought it would be. I distinctly remember recognizing Kristen from Catch That Kid when I was little, so I was like, oh, I know her. And then I vaguely, like, recognized Robert Pattinson, and then also, I wanted to call him Jacob immediately, but Taylor Lautner, from other works that they've done when we were younger. And so I just was like, this is amazing, it's wonderful, I need more. It's a book. I kind of like books now. Let me get these books. And so with my little birthday money, I distinctly remember running to Target before it closed, because we were inching around the holiday season, so late closures. So post-movie night, went and purchased the books with my birthday money and got cracking. First time I read, like, giant books, because I couldn't tell you right now how big Breaking Dawn would have been the biggest. And it was over 600, if I recall correctly. And I think that's when there was no turning back. That's when I would go to Dollar Tree, when we would go to get things, and I would buy the books in Dollar Tree. I would still get the 50%, $1, $2 books with my little monies from Books A Million, from Borders. They never had them at, Barnes & Noble, to my recollection. But would get books for a lot more money at your Barnes & Nobles. You're picking things up at Walmart, at Target, what have you. And then, of course, reading all of Twilight leans you into the whole love of, the vampire werewolf sagas. So looking through those and happening upon, like the classic iterations of things like, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then you get Frankenstein, so you're inching into fantasy that way as well. And so then by high school, because, somewhere in there is all of the, like, shows that we loved as well, like Vampire Diaries and the originals. We went upon, the dystopian fantasy slash. It's terrifying in that some of that stuff is realistic to a certain degree. Your Hunger Games and what have you. And then we inch into the time frame in which I'm like, these Jane Austens and Charlotte Brontes, they were women in this time, and being an author was like almost an act of rebellion to pursue that aspect of passion and career. So I'm going to read the books that they wrote. And that is when I really, really, really digged into Pride and Prejudice the first time. So most of 9th and 10th grade for me was a Pride and Prejudice, like, festival. That is my favorite Jane Austen novel, which I know stereotypical, but I do not care. It's my favorite novel. Second to that would be Persuasion. But Pride and Prejudice, for a multitude of reasons, will always hold a special place in my heart. One of them being the fact that Keira Knightley played the most up-to-date, to my recollection, Pride and Prejudice movie in my childhood. And Keira, from, the Pirates of the Caribbean to she did so many period pieces in film. And I love a good period piece, especially then. I was hooked. And then I would slowly inch myself into some of the other versions of Pride and Prejudice. But funny enough, when I was in 10th grade, so wonderful that I had a teacher that was accepting of, I guess, my creativity and the posting of an actual test. It was like an essay test that we had to write. It was not on Pride and Prejudice or anything like that. But I had been reading recurrently / watching Pride and Prejudice, mostly Keira Knightley's version, but also others, so much in like such a siloed period of time that I woke up that morning prior to the test and I was like almost thinking in their vernacular. And so that's how I wrote my paper. And it was on, like, I think A Doll's House, which I can't remember the author of that, but not remotely related. But it was still a creative writing piece. It just was in relation to the framework of that particular piece of literature in some way, shape, or form. She loved it. Thank God she did, because had she not, I would have been in trouble, because it definitely isn't modern American English. Obviously in this time frame, because books and media obviously intertwine. I mean, we've seen a many writer's strike impact our ability to enjoy some good television and even cut some shows short. So for me, in childhood, like the Harry Potters of the world were more cinematic enjoyments. Like, I obviously knew that there were books, but I almost was like, no, I don't want to read the books. And it ruined the series. It's just funny, because I think it was more of because I had been introduced to Harry Potter as a kid so far prior to, that would have been 2001 that it first came out, was it? So I'd have been like 5 years old. So far prior to being ever interested in books. And I had a cousin who read them all and was like waiting for the releases. And I'm also, like, even as a kid, was a little impatient. I always wanted to know what happened. And so I was fine with knowing what happened and then going back and finding out how what happened. And obviously, with the length of that series and the time frame that it took them to write the entirety of the entirety of the screenplays, and for Rowling to finish the series, I wanted no parts of that wait either. So, when did the last Harry Potter novel come out? And I'm talking about like the original, not that play. I'm looking. No, I don't want HarryPotter.com. You would think I would know this off the top of my head, but I really don't. So the first book came out in 98. I think the first movie was 01. '07. So technically speaking, I could have delved into those and gotten through them, but I was so, again, that was before my time in terms of books, and so focused on the movies. I don't even think, well, no, I'm not gonna lie, it did occur to me to read Harry Potter, the books, but that was one of those things that was always checked out. And also that's not something that's gonna take a little bit of your school money, like your Scholastic book fair money, or your birthday money. That's gonna take all of it and then some. So it never happened. But I did read, never finished, but did read the Charlie Bone series, which is basically, it's in the same way of when we those that enjoy modern romance novels, however we got there, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. They'll be like in the same settings, and it's just how do the authors differentiate the characters, and how sometimes you might have different genres that you enjoy, that you kind of cycle through, because there are certain tropes that are just so common that it's just like, I love this trope, but I've had enough for right now. Let me go back over here, and then I'll see you later. So I did do Charlie Bone, never finished it. I'm almost actually finished with it now in adulthood. But funny enough, I did finish Harry Potter before I finished Charlie Bone, and it's really funny because didn't read the Harry Potter books until adulthood, and didn't become like I was into Harry Potter like from a cinematic perspective for sure, but full on Potterhead was definitely like adulthood, a la the pandemic, because there was nothing else to do, and I was like, well, this would be a good series to sink my teeth into. So I couldn't get the physical books because everything was shut down, but there's Kindle. So from the Kindle editions and then the Audible reads, at the time it was just, I better not butcher this man's name as many times as I've listened to him go through these books. Not Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry only just became available in the States. Dale. I want to say his last name is Dale. What is this man's name? Jim Dale. I listened to the Jim Dale versions of Harry Potter morning, noon, and night through the pandemic. That, and then by the grace of God, when Stephanie finally decided to read Midnight Sun, that childhood nostalgia of, memories of the times when life was simple, was so wonderful in the middle of all of that uncertainty. And I actually, learning more about me as Dani in my Dreams of Pemberley, I was a nursing student at the time. I started in the summer of 19, and in the spring of 20, we all know what occurred. So digging into those touchstones from childhood was definitely really wonderful in creating a little bit of sense of solace and simplicity, and kind of encapsulating yourself in the joys of the simplicity of thinking back on those times, because it definitely did echo from the simpler aspects and times of life when you were younger and things weren't so complicated, and you weren't worried about if a pandemic similar to what almost killed Edward, you know, was gonna get you, quite literally. But anyway, I've probably skipped over a whole bunch of books that at some point I will talk about, but just touching on the big ones. Well, wait, I do have to go back because we talked about how we got into romance in terms of as a woman, from like a young person, like late teens or whatever. We know that a lady by the name of E.L. James came out with some novels. And so definitely had some contact with those in like 12th grade. I don't know if we were supposed to read those books, but in looking at like, what are the novels called? Flowers in the Attic. The fact that those are marketed to kids, written very well, very like horrifying in terms of like the terrors of life novels, and were marketed to kids. So it is what it is. Great literature, but I mean, obviously it touches on very dark subject matter. But anyway, that led me into more so being on, you know, apps that are beginning to being like, oh, I see you read this. Let's read this. And then, you know, as you move through movies for all of these different franchises, you're inching into, what is it? The different, like, related, oh, well, this movie's coming out, and then this book is just like this book, and all of this. And so that inches you into, like, Audible used to have its own special romance section of, similar to like Audible, what is it? Is Audible Unlimited now? Whatever their iteration of where they're free and you don't have to like pay for each book. They had that just for romance. It was wondrous. And so based on, you know, the algorithm's knowledge that I like had read 50 Shades, went into modern romance that wasn't like classical, that way, which was very interesting. And there's a lot of good works there. And to my surprise, you know, you have J.K. Rowling, E.L. James, and all, and we know like the history of like, oh, this by a lady, or, you know, Currier Bell in terms of female authors historically, just because of the framework of a woman doing anything outside of the house, the thought process about that historically, until thought processes changed. So started, you know, inching into that realm of literature. But more than anything, what struck me about that was one, like truly understanding tropes in terms of literature more than I ever had before. And we'll get back into classics at some point. But Austen is my big one, no matter what. And second to Austen, would be both Bronte sisters. But, yeah, Jane Eyre wins for me. Wuthering Heights is a very good book. It's just also very, very sad in a way that I don't find Jane Eyre to be sad. So there's that. Yeah, like actually, funny enough, when I was in the 11th grade, we did, what was it called? For Christmas, I decided I was really gonna go like hardcore into this. Like, no, I really like reading. And actually, I want to write one day. And so I want like good editions of books, not the ones that, you know, are paperback and are very easy to tear up. Because I have multiple copies of Pride and Prejudice, hardbound, leatherbound, paperback, many of which, especially the paperback, have been through it for obvious reasons. And so that was my request, was all of these like heirloom / Barnes & Noble leatherbound collection versions of books in 11th grade. But getting back to modern romance, one of the biggest things that kind of struck me from, I would say, E.L. James, following E.L. James into college, not necessarily being able to read as much in college I call it original undergrad because my nursing degree was separate. And then coming back into literature years later, where she's still in my, read history and Kindle and books, because, that's how all that works. Seeing how many women authors, one, were self-publishing, and two, were their own little marketing machines in literature. You start with romance because that's where things recommend you. But then you move into strict fantasy that isn't necessarily even tied to romance at all. And then you kind of touch back on areas of, now, please understand I'm focusing on female authors in this moment, but Tolkien is Tolkien, Dickens is Dickens. There are many names and many great works, but that female legacy in terms of the dedication and the sacrifice in certain regards that it took for earlier female authors, to participate in their works, from cultural perspectives, Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison, the way in which their writings were intriguing, and uplifting, or understandably somber in terms of just the history of certain subject matters, which occurs in literature across a multitude of individuals' cultures, but I'm an African-American woman, and so Angelou and Morrison for me, specifically, are, in terms of female authors, big ones. I'm bouncing around and I'm sorry. We'll get better at this, but the biggest thing is getting started. When I talk about modern female writers who basically have created their own LLCs, their own literary collectives, almost from scratch. I'm talking prior to even seeing the Jennifer Armentrouts and Sarah J. Maas's, which would be probably within the last year or two that I even happened upon them, would be around COVID, seeing about an author called, she goes by Whitney G. I think it's Whitney Garcia Williams is her full name, or at least was at some point. The way that she wrote and published, oh my gosh, it's when you talk about it, you say the wrong thing. Not for Whitney G, but I want to make sure I don't say her name wrong. The Slay Quartet. Laura Lynn Page. So I did not read the Slay Quartet first. And again, through the way that Amazon recommends things to you, I somehow ended up on the Fixed on You series, which is very interesting, the way that it touches on mental health, and a variety of the characters, and shows that to a certain degree, money does not save you from troubles, which we all know logically, but I don't think we acknowledge fully. I really liked that aspect of those novels, but I really hated Celia when I read the Fixed trilogy, and she ended up releasing more books than just the trilogy, but at the time it was the trilogy. I hated Celia with a screaming bloody passion. I was like, you wrote a wonderful, awful character, right? She was, you love to hate her. And, we have the Wickeds of the world and, the Maleficents in terms of our modern, cinema and literature, where it's let's look at the villain differently. And I see that and recognize that in retrospect, but at the time when she did the Slay Quartet, and I read it, I was like, I really like her writing, and I had gotten through everything else she had published, before I was willing to read Celia's novels, the novels with her as the main character. And the way she wrote Celia and what is his name? It's always when you talk about it that you forget it. I'm like, I know he's named like somebody that I know that lives in real life. Edward Fassbender. The way that she wrote them, and then to my recollection, because I listened to hers as opposed to reading them, because I'm like, it's Celia. I can't be bothered to read Celia. I'll listen to them because you write wondrously, but I'm not reading Celia. No judgment either way, because imbibing literature via audiobook or reading it or however you take it in is still engaging the mind, and it's still consumption of reading. To my mind, I do both. Life is hard. We do a lot of things, and so it's a lot easier to get through a book, being immersed in it and can't wait to find out what happens when you're reading it when you're at home, and then you get in the car and you are listening to the next steps, and then back and forth, or just listening to them in their entirety based on your ability to focus or just move through life because things get so busy. So please understand, I mean no judgment by that, but by saying like I had to listen to her, I couldn't read her, it was just like this is gonna be hard enough because it's Celia. It's like, I hope something bad, I hope she gets it kind of thing is how I felt going into the Slay Quartet. I had such vitriol for Celia. And I don't think we were at the end of the first book when I didn't love her, but I felt like she was so wondrously complex in a way that I hadn't considered before. And even these novels, because again, it's from the ilk of the, everybody has an algorithm now. It's just like this, it's just like that. Some of the more, disturbing aspects of, specifically 50 Shades, they kind of joke about the Mrs. Robinson thing, and then it's like, oh, it's echoing to The Graduate, which is like this cultural touchstone or whatever. But like the more you come in contact with that particular subject matter, and then like with perspective as an adult, it's like, this is really, really dark stuff that I don't think is made light of in a way that's like trying to be truly making light of it, because obviously, for instance, going back to 50 Shades, Anastasia, what is it called? Withheld no punches in regard to her feelings on the subject matter. But in books like Rivalry within the Slay Quartet by Laura Lynn Page, you really see like, in starker relief, if you will. Yeah. And there's, especially in like modern romance, there are a lot of books like this. I'm very happy to see, especially with, all of the things that people can encounter, that they're doing better at putting trigger warnings on audiobooks and in literature, because even that would have been now probably almost 5 years ago, because between school and not going anywhere, I can't hundreds of hours a week I was taken in of books, whether audiobooks or physical books. And like I said, within that whole recommendation algorithm, you come up against a lot of that content, and while they're very well written, obviously that type of subject matter is very dark and is very real for a lot of people. And I think our modern society looks at those kind of issues differently, but if you look back 2010 on back, the way that those types of inappropriate relationships were kind of the subject, I mean, I'm sure they still are to a lesser degree, but people will call them creepy. I don't know to what extent they were actually called out as creepy. Some of these, it's not really May December, because it can't be May December when somebody, you know, isn't at May yet. So anyway, to better subjects and happier subjects. Then inching into, as I said, you know, more contemporary novels that, you know, didn't have that subject matter, but do touch on, you know, issues in life of like, I'm a woman, I'm a career woman, this is my life, and when will I find love, right? You know, and just all the other fun things that are in novels that are actually fun and interesting and do make you think, as opposed to just, you know, repeats. And I don't mean that in a rude way. But again, tropes, right? Repeats of the same novel, because you have to leave the genre or the subgenre at some point because it gets to be too much. So okay, I get it. Whether it's like a la, you know, Slay, which does have a lot of child abuse in it. And then there's like one book called like 100 Days and 100 Nights or something like that, that was recommended to me right after I distinctly remembered it in that time frame. That was written wonderfully. The richness of the words was great. Tough book to read because of the content. So then actively trying to find good books, and then moving into like the Whitney G's, where it's still romance. Still very saucy, but not quite as dark in that regard. Then you get to the historical romances that are based on modern authors writing, but like back in those times. And those just being very interesting. And seeing all of these women that had their own little collectives around them. And Whitney G and Laurelyn Page specifically for me at the time. I don't know if in 2020 Laurelyn had her own LLC, but she has her own, at minimum, imprint now, and Whitney does have her own LLC and like media operations, which is just so wondrous to see female authors do, especially touching back on like having a love of writing and wanting to understand how to like access, you know, the ability to be an author and like what that even looked like, because you don't know until you know. And I want to say when I was going into college, basically they were just telling you that publishing / you know, those literarily focused careers were dying, and so whatever you do, don't focus on those, which is heartbreaking. But we now see the modern iteration of these careers as, you know, people are journalists in their own silos with their own followings. People are authors in their own silos with their own followings, that are then able to leverage those things to, you know, come into distribution agreements or release agreements with larger, you know, organizations like your Jennifer Armentrout's and your Sarah J. Maas's, which obviously is very different to the kind of deal structure that a J.K. Rowling has, or would have had, you know, back in the 90s when she signed on to do the Potter novels, or even some of the difficulties that I believe her name is L.J. Smith ran into in terms of ownership of the Vampire Diaries series. So from duly a business / literary / historical perspective, it's all just really very interesting, and has been fun to see. What am I reading now? So before I decided that I was going to make this a hello as opposed to a very structured review, what I was going to discuss is the soon to be finished Black Witch series, which is so wonderful and touches on, I guess you could call it, obviously in literature there are things that are subtly and or overtly discussed, themes of life, questions of things. Some would argue that like Harry Potter echoes aspects of recent by recent, I mean the 20th century global wars, and some of their world leaders, dictators in that time frame. Some of the antagonists and even protagonists in the Harry Potter series. Obviously, good versus evil is something that you're always going to see. They're common tropes, the chosen one and what have you. But the Black Witch got me in a time where I was ready for fantasy, but was tired of, how would I say, too much romance and too little like other plot, right? And it's not even that they're not written well, it's just the same thing. And you want something different. And you want your mind to work on other like thought processes in life, because when am I getting married, and who is he, and oh, I hate him but now I love him, or oh, we're gonna get back together. They're great books. And working on some of them myself. But you wanna say your thirst for other aspects of literature that we enjoy. So in the Black Witch, it still is very much focused on romantic relationships, but not in that is the central focus of her life. It's more of a requirement of the time and place that she lives in. And the Black Witch Chronicles is written by Laurie Forrest. It took me a while to get into it. It's kind of like a slow burn, I guess you would say. And it's very interesting in the fact that it's one thing when you go into a book having known the character from another series, hating them. This was the first time I'd ever read a book where I hated the main character, like, without any prior exposure to them, if that makes sense. But I think that that's by design. And it's like, you also know, like, ignorant little you, but also, in terms of some of the allegories, the allusions that she speaks to in this series. I'm interested to see where it sums up when we get to the Demon Tide. I'll be honest, I started these in probably January of this year, as we're about to close out the year. And I devoured the first book once I started getting into it, but it was a very hard book to get through because of the fact that in so many ways, at so many points, in all of her characters in her fantasy, she wants you to take a look at all of the various cultures, or most, because it might be all to her mind, but to my recollection and ability to perceive on first read, because I've only been through the Black Witch once. So many different cultures and cultural themes and thought processes, the racial purity, the unrelenting feminism, the staunch, let's say, conservatism, the staunch liberalism, the freer culture that's more bohemian versus the, more straight-laced culture, the way that they perceive one another, the taught prejudice, the subsequent resentment on both sides because of the taught prejudice, the ways in which people with full knowledge of what they're doing say, you guys were dominant, now we get to be dominant. who cares about being fair, and actively challenges that and works through somebody, you know, being exposed to others that they have been taught to revile, and slowly but surely, I won't say against their will, but with a lot of, what is the term? Eye-opening occurring through various events, coming to change their ways. So good. And then also the fact that the main character is literally the spitting image of the great, she's basically the Black Witch, the original. Effectively, they exalt her, or her memory, almost like she is like a messianic figure in the dominant culture of the Black Witch. The fact that the main character in the book literally is her spitting image, I think is very interesting, because it also speaks to how, while she has certain views, she's not necessarily overtly mean, to begin with, but because of what she looks like, people have these knee-jerk reactions to her. So even in her being the dominant figure, like in her culture and people outside of her culture who would have been oppressed by, you know, her grandmother, you know, and her culture, it's just the, you look like the Black Witch. We love the Black Witch. Oh my gosh. We hope that you're like your grandmother. To, oh my God, she looks like the Black Witch. She has to die because she's going to be the Black Witch and she's going to kill us. Or our kids or this thing. Which is very interesting because it's like, it's these knee-jerk reactions as human beings that we have for right or wrong. Because in those moments, especially in the beginning of the work, she's literally just coming from nowhere, you know, having been sheltered, having knowledge of her family history and her cultural teachings, but outside of that, you know, having no particular, she definitely has skin in the game because she can't not, but just sheltered, and just her initial experiences make it easier for her to be more racist than she was going in from just the teachings that she got. I'll be very honest, when I found out that the Demon Tide was being, no, not the Demon Tide. It's not the Demon Tide. See, the Demon Tide was out. It is the, I can remember this one. The Dryad Storm. Got to the Demon Tide when I found out the Dryad or Dryad storm was being delayed. Hurt my heart, because I was so ready to just get through all of them and then get to that last book and find out what happens to Ellerin and her story, and then all of the other individuals that we encounter in these great books that she wrote. So we are now, I guess it would be like probably about 15-20 days from the official publication of the Dryad Storm. I am so excited to find out what happens, because I would say that was the last book that I read that I really just, so I'll be happy to see what happens with that. I want to discuss the Black Witch Chronicles in greater detail. It was actually my original thought process to begin I Dream of Pemberley, but given that even the name of I Dream of Pemberley came from like a confluence of things throughout my history, throughout literary history, throughout my knowledge and love of historical romance to fantasy, primarily sci-fi as well, because fantasy, sci-fi, they intertwine at points. I wanted a backstory there, because when I talk to you, I've come, in this time frame, I've talked about working through what I Dream of Pemberley was going to look like, realizing that being really structured can work sometimes on certain subjects. But on the whole, I don't want to be that kind of reviewer and analyzer when we do like analysis of like the business practices. And I don't mean this in a rude way. Just like the how we'll have certain ones that choose to have their LLCs and publish themselves. I actually ended up taking a class through a female nurse entrepreneur who published her own book of poetry and discussed like the fact that obviously from the second you write a work, it's copyrighted, but to be able to protect the work in the courts, you have to actually go through the formalized copyright process, and you can only do that if you're in the final iteration, which is why our Teagans of the world, who we will discuss, not right now because we have been talking for a really long time, but how he released multiple versions of Lord of the Rings, how his son aided with that later in Teagan's life and then after his passing. The same with Frankenstein for Shelley. I'm getting nervous. I'm like, I know these names. But it's nerve-wracking talking about it to a camera when I'm talking to people that I haven't met. It may reach, but who knows when, right? This is 2024. Some of you might happen upon this in the next 11 days, and some of you might not see it until who knows when. But we're here, and we're getting started, and that's a beautiful thing. Next up will be an appraisal of the Black Witch Chronicles after the Dryad Storm is released. So no sooner than the middle of January. But I also want to discuss Teagan, because similar to me and Harry Potter as a kid and liking it cinematically but not really sinking my teeth into it in the literary aspect of it, it wouldn't have been it wouldn't have been first wave COVID, it would have been second wave COVID 21 that I finally started to move into Loader in the literary aspect. And just from the second that you get to like Tom Bombadil, I'm just like, I'm sorry. Granted, I still think that Loader is a wonderful adaptation, especially the fact that they're not a whole bunch of special effects. It gives it a little bit more longevity and timelessness, in my opinion, as opposed to doing everything CGI. But just when I got to Tom Bombadil and the Fellowship, I'm just like, how did I not read about this? How did I not know about this? How did I not see this? How was he not in it at all? Which, I mean, even the extended editions have a lot of information and are written very well. The cinematic piece, for what they are. And there's no way that you could have ever given the Fellowship of the Rings, even in an extended edition, any fairness if you had tried to put everything in. I would argue the same with Harry Potter. The movies are done very well, to my opinion, but obviously when they do the new iteration on HBO, there's a lot more they're going to be able to put in there. We have modern thoughts on JK and how she exists and other opinions of herself. This time I'm not going to touch on that, but to the extent of the series that they're working on at HBO, the fact that she is still living, I think will do that work, and especially because she takes she's not a steward.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
Because she takes such stewardship over her creations, I think that they'll be good because she's still involved in, it's her work, so her involvement is necessary to ensure that like certain things don't get corrupted. And even like a lot of criticism toward her has been that she says things about certain characters and then you don't see them like acted out in the book, played out in the books. I think that'll be able to be touched on, hopefully, in the HBO series. We shall see. And then what else? One of my favorite things, this will be my last 2 points because I could talk. I'm a chatty girl. But one of the things I love most about Teagan, specifically when we talk about fantasy, is that he wrote it from like a historical perspective, as almost as though he was analyzing a history of a culture as opposed to being its, great omniscient as the author, which I think many of us enjoy very much. So I liked that, and I still to this day like it, and I have read through multiple times all of Loader. Haven't gotten through The Hobbit yet, I'll be very honest. I've read it though. I've read all of Loader. I've listened to the old school, I think it was the 50s that the original to my mind, or my access on Audible, Loader audiobooks were released. And then when Andy did his versions, it was just so wonderful. But similar to the way that Teagan writes, and just being just kind of like drenched in history as well, finding authors that have works like that is something that I'm very interested in. I'm starting to get into the Reddits and the right places on Goodreads to get to better recommendations for books like that. But you might not like the series, some people don't. But marrying that with going back to vampires and werewolves and demons and all the things, and witches, the Discovery of Witches series, in the way that it looks at history. I think it's actually a marriage of some of the things I enjoy most about the Black Witch Chronicles, and that I enjoy about like the historical nature in which Teagan writes, because obviously in both of them being professors, the main characters of that series, it's just something about it. And then also her history. I'm gonna get the name because not having the name is rude. And it's also is the name of the actual trilogy, but A Discovery of Witches, or ADAL, is how you typically find it on like a Reddit. What is her name? And she's actually still working on expanding that universe, so it'll be very interesting to see what Deborah Harkness does with that, because she just actually released a continuation book about some of the progeny of the characters from the original series. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. But when I do talk about how I feel and the ways in which I love A Discovery of Witches, there will be spoilers. So I do apologize to anybody who isn't like me in the sense that they can, or they like to find out what happens and then read about how it happens. But up to now, I would say that that's a good series, and to sink your teeth into that. I have kept you guys for a very long time. I might actually end up having to split this up into parts. I don't know how this works. I have not done videos this long before. But I'll see you in the future. And we'll talk about other things and some of the same things in greater detail and more formalized. But intro to me, intro to, I call her IDOP, right? Intro to IDOP. And a little bit of what we'll be doing to begin with. So for those of you who have managed to stay this long or through this many cuts of the video, I thank you. For those who didn't have it in, fair. For others, remember you can always, I believe for YouTube it's as much as ×2 speed. So yeah, because very long. I reminded myself of one of my YouTube faves, EDB, which is Emily D. Baker, who when I first started listening to her especially, would always do like 3 or 4 goodbyes before she would actually get off. So bye now. It was great chatting with you. I will definitely be chatting more. The Black Witch Chronicles will be the next big thing that's up. And then I'll probably do something else fantastical. And then I'll start to go into probably some nostalgia, historic literary works, and then move into historical romance, because there's a host of series that I really enjoy that I would recommend. I will be doing recommendation style videos as well, where you don't get too much into things, but you're like, I like it because of this reason, I like it because of that reason. And some of them could be very old books, some of them could be new books. It's the nature of literature, you know, in certain categories and certain tropes. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll be chatting with you later on. Have a wonderful one.